Okay. So thank you for those that are joining us. You will be automatically muted upon entry, but you'll be able to send chats in the question and answer area. So as you think of questions or things that you hear and want to know more about, please include it there. And then we will have it up live. All right, so give me one more second, y'all. Okay, so, all right, hang on one more second. Okay, so thank you to all of those that are joining us. Okay, so as we get everything set up, we're going to start with some introductions of our fabulous speakers. So my name is Anastasia Taylor, and I'm the Executive Director of Alliance Child and Family Solutions. And this topic is one that I think is very necessary with all the things that we're going through right now with current events. And so the more that we discuss kind of internally the issues that we were facing, the more we decided that we needed to have an open conversation about this. So I'm glad you guys could join. Stick with us for any IT issues, bear with us. Again, if there's anything that you missed or have questions about, there's the question and answer box. So it's a little bit different than chat, but you can put it there. And again, we'll be going live. It will be recorded. And so we're glad you guys are here. All right. Give me 1 second. So while I get that set up, I'm going to let each of you do some introductions. So I'm going to start with Camille. So can you give your name and how you ended up being roped into this live discussion today? You have to unmute first, though. I'm so sorry.
Okay, unmuted. I'm Camille Davis Hayes. I'm the Director of Operations with Alliance Child and Family Solutions. I kind of got roped into this just as you and I were having a conversation one day just about the state of the world, what's going on as we were watching the news, and specifically how it impacted me one day just in my family. I had a task, you know, during the pandemic, everybody shut down immediately. And so we had to go pick up my daughter's stuff from school and just stuff that she left there back in March. And I have a 19-year-old son who, you know, had put on the family calendar. You got to get up, you got to go downtown, and you got to pick your sister's stuff up. Once everything started happening with George Floyd and the protests and things like that, I decided I could not send him to do that. And so that's how it came up with us.
Yeah, so I'm glad you're a part of the discussion. So again, Camille is our Director of Operations. She's a fabulous part of helping keeping Alliance Child and Family Solutions, or ACFS, running behind the background. So Dr. Dixon, I will go to you next.
Awesome, y'all. So my name is Brian Dixon. I'm a psychiatrist here in Fort Worth. I own a private practice called Progressive Psychiatry, which just relaunched as a new brand called Mindful. So y'all can check it out at findmindful.com. I am here because I also sit on the board of directors at Alliance Child and Family Solutions, and I'm a big believer in therapy. And I believe that every person on this webinar, every person in America should have a therapist. And if you don't have a therapist, you need to find a therapist, and we can talk about how to do that a little bit later on. So thanks so much for being on tonight, y'all.
And let me put another plug that he is on our board of directors. He's a great individual, and that's how he's related here. Now, next, I'm going to introduce Jen Sarduy, and she has been both a fabulous friend of mine, as well as the trainer for an upcoming diversity training that we have with ACFS. So she's been roped in multiple ways, but I'm going to let you give the full introduction of all the things that you do, because you have a lot going on.
I do. Again, my name is Jen Sarduy. I use she or they pronouns. I'm the co-founder of Rebirth Equity Alliance. We're a nonprofit working nationally, but also locally in Tarrant County to increase, we build bridges in pursuit of like birth justice. So we do birth justice work in the framework of social determinants of health. So our work looks like a lot of on the ground things, like we're doing an HIV testing clinic this Saturday, and we do systematic racism in perinatal health and implicit bias management training for providers nationwide, both virtually and in person. We do community-based sex ed, all kinds of stuff. Mobile mental health clinic, our biggest thing, which we partner with ACFS on, and Fort Worth Music Therapy Fund. And it's a great event where community members can sign up to get a free session just on a Saturday. We do it quarterly, and it's low barrier and super accessible. We hope to be. And so we're excited for the next one coming up next month, and we're excited always to partner with ACFS. I also do community organizing with an organization called Fort Worth Futures, which looks at public safety in a whole new light, and how we can spend our public safety dollars and think about what that means for our communities. And with ODAID, which does overdose awareness and prevention work in Fort Worth. So I do lots of things, like Stas said, and I got roped into this call because I'm a subject matter expert. I train on systemic racism and perinatal health, and how to have better client relationships, and more sensitive client relationships, and more aware client relationships. And so I'm so excited to be here and to just chat with other subject matter experts and advance all of our knowledge together, because it's a continued process. As we all know, you're never de-biased, you're never done, you're never just woke. Like it just keeps going. So I'm excited to continue this work with y'all today.
Perfect. And so as a segment, just to kind of go into the discussion about these things, I wanted to share a video clip that shows a lot of the conflicting ideas that we're being faced with currently with the news and with current protests. So hopefully you can see my screen. And here we go.
While the phrase Black Lives Matter is gaining traction all around the world, the phrase All Lives Matter is facing backlash. CBS 2's Carolyn Gossoff explains this.
Black Lives Matter! The Black Lives Matter mantra, a sorrowful rallying cry, at times answered with this retort.
All lives matter, not just black lives.
An obvious statement, all lives matter, but in this moment seen as twisting the Black Lives Matter message, just when the nation is focused on the deep wounds of racism. It's unleashed a flurry of explainers.
I don't think that the people that are posting all lives matter should be canceled. I think they should be educated.
Now I realize that it is dismissive.
For example, if you ran into someone that was trying to raise awareness for breast cancer and then you said, whoa, wait, there are other types of cancers too, you know, that is not cool.
Sometimes stated in quiet posts, all times hurtful, says Sydney Daniel, a Long Island nurse who's heard it shouted in anger this week.
It's how they're saying it. It's kind of like, all lives matter, so just go home. What's the issue? Some people don't even know how racist they actually are by that comment.
Dismissive of a painful history that Black lives have not appeared to matter to everyone, born out of the acquittal of George Zimmerman and the murder of Trayvon Martin. Hofstra University professor of rhetoric Tamika Robinson says the All Lives Matter response tries to remove race from what needs to be a race discussion.
It is tone deaf, and they don't get that what they're saying is deracializing a movement. But there are certainly some bad actors that absolutely are using it as a way to silence and a tool of further oppression, to saying, like, we shouldn't deal with this. This is not a real issue. This is not an American issue.
Yet others say All Lives is an expression of support for police, the vast majority who do their jobs honorably. Long Island radio host Eric Koppelman.
All Lives Matter simply says that we as a people, we as human beings, we as mankind need to live together and to be able to survive peacefully. And it's not an insult.
That's not the way Francesca Miranda hears it. The Justice for George organizer thinks the counter slogan misses the point.
When you say Black Lives Matter, you don't say only Black Lives Matter.
Protesters say you wouldn't need a Black Lives Matter movement if all lives truly mattered. Implied in the slogan is the unwritten word Black Lives Matter also. In Westbury, Long Island, Carolyn Gussoff, CBS 2 News.
All right, so give me 1 second. Okay, so with that news clip, obviously there's a lot of different opinions and discussions, and I am simply the moderator, not the speaker. So let me give just a quick story of personally how some of these recent events affected me. So again, this is more of a personal level than a professional level, but I had gotten a call to do a segment on NBC about how to explain to kids about diversity. And it kind of brought out some hypocrisy in me that I had not had that same conversation with my own children. And so it really spurred that conversation. Now, my daughter is biracial. She's African American and then Caucasian. And when I explained why people were protesting and why there were riots, her immediate question was, I don't understand how there's racism because I thought that went away with Martin Luther King. And so I had to explain, well, yeah, that happened. And her next question was, well, isn't the government there to help protect us? So what are they doing as government and police to protect? And honestly, I kind of hemmed and hawed, and I wasn't exactly sure how to answer those difficult questions. And I said, you know, there are really good people that protect us. And that's a great question. And she started to cry. And I said, you know, and I asked her, I said, Lily, why are you crying? And she goes, well, the man that was killed could have been my dad. And so it brought it home. It was very, very heartbreaking as we've had to have these conversations. And the other thing that came up from this is I have no general racism that I face on a daily basis, simply because I was born with a different color skin. And while going through social work school, we acknowledge and we learn about what is white privilege, I have the benefit and the white privilege of being able to forget until these things happen. And so it's a very, very hard conversation. And I know a lot of us, and I say us meaning all humankind, have questions about what is our role in all of these things. You know I wanted to go out and protest with my daughter, but there's COVID. And so how do we choose of how to be involved in these difficult subjects? So again, that is my personal experience of how it really started to come home and have these difficult conversations. And also how we move forward from there so that there's no race that's all bad or all good, but how do we deal with these tough subjects? But it also brought up the idea that why am I speaking on a subject that I have no personal experience with? no firsthand experience with. And so just to bring out the elephant in the room, that's why we've asked various Black and African American speakers to be here, because I can't speak on something that I'm not facing on a daily basis. And so that's why I am moderator and wanting to turn it over to individuals to hear their perspective. And so that kind of starts with the first question of, with the current events, what's one thing that you think is important for people to know about how that affects you on a daily basis?
I think it's so important. I think you mentioned something really important, which was that Lily was thinking that it ended with Martin Luther King Jr., right? And we think of racism in a very historical sense, when in actuality, like, it's built into our system. So it's never something we've not been experiencing. And I think it's important to keep that like collective trauma and that like generational trauma in mind when we talk about racism, right? It's never been over. Our systems today were built by, you know, our policing was, you know, ex-Confederate soldiers. It was built on that system. So it's hard to separate that historical information from like what is happening today, because it is one and the same. I think it is difficult to have these conversations, but it's also necessary, and we don't have a reason not to do it. We know that like silence about racism increases racism, and it increases also anxiety about talking about race, right? So we're just like in this endless loop where it's harder and harder to talk about, the more reluctant we are to do so. And so this is a crucial conversation, and I'm really looking forward to it.
And Stas, I think like you and I discussed when you shared with me about just Lily, was that you had, just because of just the nature of your upbringing, your background, and just the fact that you are Caucasian, you have the option to not discuss it with your kid. I've never had that option. Just in kind of, you know, dialoguing with Solomon about it the last couple of days, I'm like, you know, when do you remember the first conversation? He was like, I never not remember having it. I mean, it's not just a one-time thing. It is a constant. Every time you leave the house, do not forget, you know, this is something you have to be aware of, you know. So it's an ingrained part of our everyday life, our conversations. It's there all the time. And, you know, for many, because I don't want to say that every African-American family has a conversation, but for many, it's part of that. It's part of the discussion. It's part of the upbringing. It's part of just growing and developing. And as they matriculate into adulthood, you continue to have those conversations. I think Solomon said he was 4 when he first recalls me having a conversation with him about, you know, how he may be viewed, how interactions with other people may be determined solely because of the color of his skin.
Yeah, and to add on to that, and especially to tack on to what Jen was talking about, so when it's built into the system, sometimes there are overt signs that it's there, and that's when you see stuff happening like Black people being shot while they're out jogging, Black people being choked while they're being arrested for, you know, no good reason. But then there are also times when it's very kind of covert, where it's very insidious. So for example, when I go to the bank, I was talking with my banker the other day, and there are tools and there are formulas that banks use to give loans. And the research shows that Black people pay more for credit, right? Or when I go to get my loan, so I have a lot of debt from all these degrees that are behind me, and I go to apply, and if my debt to income ratio is not right, then I don't get a loan. Well, even though I'm a great credit risk and that sort of thing, that prevents me from building intergenerational wealth that I can pass on to my kids, right? So, and people say, well, you know, everybody's equal. Well, not really, because if you look at how much money white men make compared to everybody else, it is drastically different. And for African-American women, they make, I think it's 68 or 69 cents to the dollar that a white man makes, right? So it's covert, it's overt, it's never easy, and it won't improve unless we talk about it. So I'm glad that we're here tonight.
Yeah, so jumping off on that, it brings up the question of, there are so many ways that it is ingrained in our society. There's so many ways that it's the overt, the covert, that we're seeing these generational effects. And so what do we do about it? So like, how do we make the changes happen both with our kids and currently and globally or in our communities? So I'm gonna toss it back to Dixon because you brought it up.
So, and I'll go real fast because I can't wait to hear what Jen and Camille had to say. So how do you fix it? So there is a big discussion about reparations and what that means. I know in trauma work, it's really important to recognize that a trauma happened and then try to build some healing and some closure around that. One of the ideas that I'm pitching out and then I'm putting in my blog posts and that sort of thing is that we have the capability now to have every Black person enrolled in a direct care practice, which essentially is a new way of making sure that African Americans are getting health care. Because right now, the way that the system is structured, it's really, if you don't have a certain type of insurance or somebody may not be in your insurance network, it's hard. And so there are more and more doctors who are doing this kind of a membership model where they say, you know what, we'll have 100 patients in our panel and you pay us a monthly fee and I will give you 24/7 access to care. And so that's one of the things I'm working on. So that we can start healing our bodies and then hopefully eventually get everybody a therapist.
So speaking of therapists, Camille, I'm going to tag you in.
And I was just going to say, I wanted to go back to the statement that Dr. Dixon said earlier about, you know, just working on getting everybody a therapist, because just like Jen touched on, there is a deep-seated historical trauma. It is traumatic to see, you know, I want to kind of say like it's almost every summer, you know, that this happens, that we watch this kind of stuff unfold. And it is traumatic. It's really tough for us to watch that. People who look like us get killed, you know, on Facebook Live, TV, or whatever else. It's very tough. And just like you said with your daughter, she was like, well, that could be my dad.
Yeah,
it could be. That's the reality. And so there's a trauma in that. There's a trauma in, you know, knowing that when you leave the house, it's not that you are a person first, you are Black first. And that, you know, as a parent raising my children, I have to say, you know, you are, you know, you can be well respected, you can be this, you can be smart, you can be everything, but you're going to be perceived as a Black first, and you have to know that. And so, you know, the thing, you have to have that conversation, and it can't just continue to be in African American homes. It has to be with our team of therapists to be able to say, you know, they're going to come in with trauma, and it may not look like what you've worked with before. You know, and be able to be sensitive to that and understand it and not kind of just write it off as an inconvenience or whatever else, because, you know, this isn't it's not an inconvenience for us. This is our life. This is what we're living in. This is what we have to deal with every single time, you know, something like this happens.
So I'm going to go off in a whole different direction, y'all. But I think that what is required of us on an individual level, what is required of white people on an individual level, is to divest from whiteness, right? Like race-based classification systems are invented, right? And we need them to uphold white supremacy, which is like the elephant, right? And so like divesting, what do I mean by divesting from whiteness, right? We talk about divesting a lot in terms of police. What I mean by that is like, since we know that whiteness is not a thing, right? We also know that like, we hold it as a thing, right? So if you're calling yourself white, you're holding something about that rather than holding your heritage, right? So I say like, try to hold your heritage a little bit more and realize that like whiteness asks you to give up your wholeness in order to keep white supremacy around. Don't give up your wholeness for whiteness. Like don't allow whiteness to have the room. And that is like the simplest way that I can put that. But I think that is what's required of us collectively, is to acknowledge it on a personal level and reject it. And I think as long as we're comfortable not rejecting it, it will not leave. It will not go quietly into the dark, white supremacy.
And I want to add off of what Jen said, in rejecting it, we can't just, it seems like it kind of ebbs and flows, like it comes and then it dies down and it goes. We can't continue to let it just go. We have to continue to reject it every day, all the time, whenever we see it, and hold one another accountable. Because that's what happens. It's like, oh, well, it just kind of goes by the wayside or whatever else. We have to stay vigilant and continue to have the conversations.
Well, and you bring up a quote that when we were talking again about the theme of diversity and what does this mean and race and how does it all play in, you said, I can't turn off being Black. And I saw another quote as well that said, you know, if so many African American and Black families are teaching their kids how to respond to police in a way that won't get them killed, are Caucasian or Irish American, again, it's hard, you know, getting rid of the whiteness, you're right, but are other families teaching their kids how to not be racist on as equally of an active basis? And so that kind of leads into the question of how can parents make this change? What do they tell kids about what's going on? How often should this conversation be happening? You know, how do they refer to race, or how do they have these discussions in a way with kids, especially ones that are young or elementary school age? So I'm going to toss it to Jen.
I think that it's important, like when we think about what the work that people do before we see them, right? So as clinicians, do you think about how people have to code switch before they even get to your door, right? Like how they're changing their appearance and demeanor. And so I teach those skills to my children unknowingly all the time. My 6-year-old code switches like a pro, right? And that is like, that contributes to weathering, right? So if you're thinking about, if you're keeping that frame, right, that Black people are constantly doing work just to be acceptable in the eyes of white people, and you think about that amount of work from a young age, and you put that into the education that you're giving your Scottish children, then that would be revolutionary, right? That would be the change. When it's in every movement, when you're always calling out racism, that's the change. So being able to call it out is a huge part of being able to manage it. We have to be able to call it out within ourselves. Like science tells us that the bias blind spot affects 85% of the population thinks they're less biased than their neighbors. Like we know that ain't true. So I think that like keeping that frame in mind and thinking about like how large this actually is and what kind of like scope Black people face on a daily basis really should inform the amount that you're speaking to like your children about race.
Yeah, so Camille, I'm going to toss to you in a second just to add on to that of specifics of, you know, what do you say to your children, regardless of what race they are? What things would you hope that other parents are saying to their children who may not be Black or African American? But also, how do clinicians handle this if they're working with racist individuals? You know, to what extent do you address that? And in the therapy setting, when they may say it as a passing comment and not even see it as a problem?
So in the therapy setting, I think you can address it the same way that you do intrusive thoughts, you know, things like that. You call it out. You stop it in its tracks and you call it out. I think therapeutically, there's nothing wrong with that. That's, you know, because it is part of the healing and working progress, I think, to be able to do that. I mean, we do that when it comes to, you know, anxiety and depression and things like that. We call it out. We talk about the elephant in the room, and that's what you need to do therapeutically, because therapists will come in contact with people. I mean, Jen and I kind of talked about the trauma of the patients coming in, but we will come in contact with people who have these racist beliefs and things like that. And it just needs to be addressed head on.
So Dixon, add to that. Tell me your thoughts.
Yeah, so one of the fun parts about being a child psychiatrist and working with mostly kids is I get to teach parents a whole lot of childhood development, typical childhood development. And in typical childhood development, I always emphasize that your kids are watching everything that you do all the time. They know your moods. They know exactly how to push to get what they want. They know when to pull back. They know everything about you. And so To Jen's point, if you want your kids to be as inclusive and as wonderful as possible, you have to do your work. I cannot stress this enough. It is not my responsibility to teach you about anti-racism. It's not my job to teach you history. I'm a scholar in psychiatry. I'm a scholar in healthcare finance reform. I am not a scholar in African-American studies. I happen to be one. But I don't know all the literature and the pedagogy and all of that. There are people out there that do, and you should listen to them. You should buy their books. You should attend their webinars, right? So if you're on this webinar and you're like, what do I do? Do your homework. And when you do your homework, guess what your kids then do? They do their homework, and it turns into this awesome cycle of learning. And you can admit your flaws. So your kids are incredibly resilient. They have a ton of grit, and don't underestimate them. So when you say, yeah, I'm sorry that I said that, I'm sorry that I called the cops on the guy in the park in New York, when you admit fault and you embrace it and you say, I want to learn from this, your kids will do the exact same thing.
And so just, maybe this is a harder question, maybe not, but for those that may not, I think Jen said it earlier, we all think our neighbor is more biased than ourselves. And so for those that may be saying, look, I really don't think I'm biased. I really don't, maybe they don't have kids, and they say, I want to make a difference. I can't go out and march. I'm not really sure even what I'm asking for. What would you tell those that are really struggling with how to engage in the topic of racism and diversity and, structural inequities and all the big words that are hard to spell and pronounce? How do they get involved, and how do they do, what are the beginning steps of even doing research? What do they search for? Dixon.
Yeah, so we have this wonderful search engine tool called Google, and if you just type in Google, hey, how to not be racist, that's where you can start. So it's one of those things. I don't want people to overthink this, and right now I can be a bit glib about it because it's heartbreaking, and if I'm not laughing, I'm crying, right? And so I tell people all the time, I'm a really good compartmentalizer. So when awful, terrible things happen, I put it in a little box and I put the box on the shelf and I deal with it later. I have lots of boxes on my shelves that I have to manage, in addition to running a private practice and paying my taxes and being a good boyfriend and being a blah, 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 right? So I don't have the capacity to do that teaching. And so, yeah, Google, Dr. Google is awesome. Don't believe everything you read. So once you do your first round, if you have questions, by all means, reach out to me because I'll help clarify. But yeah, Dr. Google first.
Okay, so
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I was just about to transition.
Because I'm just such an avid reader. I mean, educate yourself. There's books. There's history. Just look at the history, and then challenge yourself when you have a belief, but then you read something different. Look further than just what is handed to you. Because, like Dr. Dixon said, Dr. Google, don't believe everything you read. However, challenge yourself with the things that you read that just don't add up. They don't make sense. We see so much about, there are people that say that systematic racism does not exist. Challenge yourself. Challenge yourself. Challenge that belief, and find facts on the other side of that. Those are some things that you can do to begin to actually start the process of just digging further. Educate yourself.
That's great.
I usually refuse to answer this question because I feel a lot like Dixon, and I'm like, it has been said by a Black person somewhere, and somebody has ripped it off from a Black person somewhere. So you've had multiple opportunities to receive this information is the thing. But I think honestly, if we want to talk about ways to be a better ally, reject white supremacy, be a co-conspirator, right? Because what we're really talking about when we talk about being an ally, we don't really want allies. What we want is people who are willing to match their risk level to the risk level that Black people take every day, right? So comparatively, how much risk is in your life as opposed to the life of a Black person, right? In pursuit of justice. And then I will say, like, some ways that you can reject white supremacy and be a better ally is to take up less space. Non-Black people take up less space in like conversations about Blackness, you know. We have to like honor our BIPOC allies and make sure that we're giving them the space to be the people verbalizing their own stories. And I think also, in addition to taking up less space, I would say find some really highly recommended pages on the social platform of your choice and follow them. Don't say anything. Don't comment. Practice saying less, fam. Practice saying less.
Well, and I think that's a good point because after, you know, the shooting of George Floyd, a lot of the things that I saw circulating were both with the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm sorry, too many words, as well as lift Black voices. And that's one of the things that I hadn't thought of, just personally, not that I speak on behalf of all Caucasian people by any means, but I would say even though I consider myself a diverse person, educated, that I try and research these things, it's those basics of, you know, if you don't know where to start, Google, why are people upset? Why are people rioting? Why are people looting? How many people have died at the hands of police? How, you know, ask those hard questions, even ask it to Google, find different sources, because in the same way, you don't want to be representative of all Caucasian people. We shouldn't ask any of our friends of a certain color to be representative of the entire race, because that's absurd. Just like all Texans don't wear cowboy boots and ride horses to school. Those things that we generalize and we laugh at, but we get to turn that off. And our friends don't.
Can I say something real quick? And to Jacqueline Chavez's question that's in the box, because she was asking, she said that she's on edge with people's comments. I had a Caucasian male tell me how he loves the history of white supremacy. I was silent but wanted to react defensively. Would you feel that this is a racist comment? So what I would throw out to you, and this is, I'm going to try to put these two things together. When bad things happen, period, oftentimes people will go, oh, that person had a mental health disorder, or there's something mental health going on. And the research shows that, number one, mental health, people with mental health concerns are no more violent than anybody else. But more importantly, a criminal act should be dealt with criminologists. I'm not a criminologist. I do not predict people's bad behaviors. I'm a mental health clinician, and I help people who have mental health concerns, right? And so the correlation to this is the same. If you're around a white supremacist, it is not your job to try to correct them. I would tell you, unless they're like somewhat attached to you, meaning like married, or there's some kind of intense relationship, if you don't feel like that's the time and the place to fight that fight, don't fight it. It's really hard to change someone who actively hates you. I would say you spend more of your time in those areas where you feel more powerful, that you have a connection with that person, because that's, to me, that's where you get changes. When you have a relationship and someone goes, oh, wow, that's a blind spot for me. I didn't realize that when I said that. Teach me. That's where you expend your energy. But on knuckleheads who don't want to change, bye.
And I think that brings up, you know, how to interact when you see people's posts on Facebook. So I'll kind of throw it to y'all to answer that, because on one hand, there is the need to say, well, if I really don't agree and I think this is wrong, do I block them? Do I unfollow? Do I unfriend? What do I do? And then on the other hand, it's okay, well, I should correct this. And then on another hand, if you have three hands, it's okay, so how do I address this person so that I'm just not shouting my point while they shout their point and we have no progress? So what are some ways that you guys would suggest responding to people who are posting stuff on social media that you may not agree with? And I'll go to Jen, because she's my social media person, whether she wants to be or not.
I feel like I try to build bridges, and I don't super agree with cancel culture, and in that, like, I don't think that anyone in my community is worth or like able to be disposed of in that way. So that also doesn't mean that I need to engage with every post that I see. So as a Black person, sometimes my protecting myself comes before, you know, doing anything for anyone else. And so sometimes that means unfollowing or hiding. You can choose to engage, but also, like, I would ask, you know, is it helpful? Is this your argument? Are you willing? And what is the probability of you causing change here, right? Like, are you educating this person, or are you posting because this is harmful and you don't want someone else reading it to think that it's okay and no one noticed? You know, what is your motivation? I think that slowing down our actions and being more thoughtful before we do things is a huge way to manage bias in our lives and practices. And so slowing down our decision making when we're wanting to engage in something like that, it'll probably still be there in 3 minutes, or it won't, and then it's not your problem anymore, right? So like, take the time to make that decision carefully, because being reactionary in that way really just hurts us and hurts our relationships and our community bonds, which is what we need to leave white supremacy. We want to leave it behind.
And to add on to that, Sass, I think one thing that I do, I'm not the social media guru, but I have some people that are, you know, they are walk the fence sometimes on social media. I follow. I mean, I'm still friends with them. I don't block them. I don't unfriend them. You know, I scroll, I read, and for me, it helps me to understand what the mindset is, what they're thinking, what their biases are, and things like that. And I know, just being a mental health clinician and trained in that area, I'm able to kind of read between the lines sometimes, but it gives me that foundation to be able to know, because I don't, you know, I don't know what's on everyone's mind. You know what I'm saying? Like, what drives their biases and their beliefs and their hatred or whatever else. And so I don't necessarily, you know, agree with the cancel culture either. It's like, let's see what they're saying, because it kind of keeps me informed also.
Yeah, so I think just to add on, and then, you know, I saw a comment saying choosing not to respond to a racist or someone who we think won't change, does that not equate to silence? Perceiving ourselves versus taking a stand. And I think, again, I'm going to throw this to Dixon, so get prepared in a second, but I think it's that back and forth of, you know, who's the person posting? Is it your second cousin twice removed that lives in the boondocks that you really only talk to once a year and get their Christmas card? Or is it someone where you're like, wow, I'm really surprised by their comments? Or maybe regardless of who it is, you say, hey, I don't really want to debate, but I just want to say that for me and myself, I'm not okay with that comment. And I would love to sit down for coffee post-COVID, or a virtual coffee, and have that discussion with you. That would be my perspective, but I'm going to toss it over to Dr. Dixon.
Yeah, and there's no one right answer with this at all, and it changes because people change and times change and circumstances change. One of my favorite quotes, and I hope this guy's not a racist because I use this quote all the time, but it's by Will Rogers, and he says that not everybody can be a hero because somebody has to stand on the curb and clap as they go by. And yes, sometimes you need to be the hero. You need to take the bull by the horns and you say, no, that is inappropriate, right? So if your loved one close to you says something like that, I think you stand up and you go, yeah, that's not really cool to me. That's really hurtful. I did not appreciate it, right? But if it's some person in Walmart who's talking nonsense, that's not your cross to bear. I would just keep walking as long as he's not violating your person. I'm saying he, but he or she is violating your person, then you can choose if you want to interact or not. Your personal Facebook page is your personal page, or Instagram page, right? So if somebody comes onto your page, by all means, you can say, nope, that's not tolerated. But if you see nonsense on somebody else's page, you can keep scrolling. You have that right. So yeah, there's no right answer. I'd say follow your heart when it comes to this kind of stuff.
And if you choose to engage everyone, like,
you're going to be exhausted.
You're going to be exhausted.
You're probably not doing so effectively, and you're probably speaking over someone else if you're engaging everyone.
It's because it's, you know, it doesn't stop.
Yeah. So I think that's a quick way of, hey, I'm not going to engage, but I don't agree. End of story. Don't let them kind of loop you back in. But I think the point to draw from that is there's no right or wrong. And if you overhear someone in Walmart saying things that you know or you're not okay with, If you are with someone else or your kids, that's where you can say, man, I don't know if you heard them or not, but those comments really hurt my feelings. How do you think someone would hear if they heard that? What should we do to combat those things, or to try and be more loving and understanding to others? Or what would you tell them if it was one of your close friends and they said that? So that you're starting to have those conversations. I think with race and diversity, and it's one of those topics that's kind of like sex ed. We all say we'll have the talk when it's time, but there's never this time where you're like, oh, I feel completely comfortable with explaining all the ins and outs to my children and answering every single question. You start somewhere. You have the conversation frequently, because if you wait for them to ask you your opinion, it's never going to get there. So you have to have open talks. And on the opposite side, in confronting some of your own bias, I would say, look at who surrounds you. Are your friends diverse? Do they all look the same, believe the same? Because it's easy to have people that think and talk and look the exact same way that we do. But what happens when you have people that maybe they have staunchly different political views, or maybe they're of different races or religions? And how do you show that you are trying to engage in those decisions, to have those conversations, even when it's hard, even when you may not agree at the end? Now, another question that came through was, as a counselor, and so Dixon and Dr. Davis Hayes, I'll be going to y'all, but as a counselor in the helping field, how do you know that you're meeting the needs of African American clients? So Dr. Dixon, I'll let you tackle that first.
Yeah, so this is actually really hard, and also ties into the next question a little bit later on. So every Black person is different. Even though we have a shared experience because of whiteness and white supremacy, we're very, very different. And so in therapy, we are taught to meet the patient or meet the client where they are. And so, I've worked with Black families who are kind of very similar to the families that I grew up with. And then there are some who are very, very different. And so I'm a big believer, the way that I was trained in my limited therapy. So I'm not trained in all the therapeutic modalities that all of my awesome panelists are. But I'm very much in the mindset, or trained in the vein that I am kind of, I wouldn't say innocent bystander. Like if something egregious happened, I would say something, but I generally don't try to pull or push them one way or another unless I can figure out what their goal is. And so, so if they are an African-American client and they come in with depression, I help them treat their depression. If they come in with anxiety, I help them treat their anxiety. I do it with my own kind of swagger, but if I perceive that is not going to be helpful, then I just don't do it. So, because it's about the patient, the client, and not about myself. So that's kind of how I walk this really fine line.
I think in response to the first question by Lindsay, I think you ask them. I think if you feel like there's an issue or concern, or you're, maybe not culturally aware, or feel like there's some kind of deficit there on your end, you ask them. You have to track your client's progress, and are they meeting objectives and things like that. But if you feel like you're not meeting their cultural needs, there's nothing wrong with having an open dialogue about that. Again, it all goes back to just open, plain, frank communication. And that, I think that's the biggest key.
A lot of the shortfalls of those kind of situations can be mitigated by having relationship-based care. Like Camille was saying, just like having relationship-based conversations where you're just having a conversation like, hey, I'm not sure if I'm helping you in this. Is this like important to you? Can we talk about this a little bit? Just, we have so much race-based anxiety that we're afraid to even address it. And that's not helpful practice either. So I think keeping in mind that the people across from you are also people, and, maybe don't know how to bring that up either. Sometimes telling people what to expect from us is really helpful in preventing like microaggressions also, saying when you have to like ask different questions to get to a point, that can increase anxiety. So saying like, hey, I'm going to ask you a series of questions because I need this specific information and this is how I can get it, can just like release them from that right from the beginning. So just like making our care more human. can go a long way towards like bridging that gap, Stas.
No, I like that. Because I think especially as clinicians, as we grow in our practice, I know as we do initial assessments, one of the things we ask about is, you know, about the depression, the anxiety, the family background. Are you married? Do you have kids? You know, and as we've grown, we ask, okay, well, what about your sexual preferences? How does that affect you currently? Is there anything you're concerned about with that? Is there any trauma? Okay, are there any cultural beliefs or things, you know, how does your race impact maybe your care? Asking people, again, I don't have the answers. I don't know how that's perceived because I'm not living it, but that's where we have the open conversation of saying, I don't have the answers and I can empathize with you even though I really haven't had that experience and I'm sorry. Tell me more about how I can support you in this. So another question that came in is if your client makes a racist comment in session, regardless of the race of the therapist, is it the right time and space to address that? Or could addressing it and trying to correct it turn the session to what the therapist needs to discuss or dissect versus what the client needs to process? Dixon, you get to go because you're laughing.
Oh man, and again, it's the caveat asterisk, your mileage may vary, right? So it depends on what's said, who says it, what your relationship is with them, you know, established versus new patient, blah, blah, blah. The way that I generally treat things like that is anytime something happens that I think is a major detriment to the session, I then call it out and I go, yeah, so that's not what, you know, for example, if a kid threw a fit in the office, I go, yeah, that's not really helpful. If somebody said, you know, the N word or did something, I go, yeah, that's not really helpful. That's not how I do things. So if that's something, if that's the way you want to approach it, it may be that, you know, somebody else is a better fit for you, but that's not going to fly, you know, and the key that I do, the thing that I use is I don't take it personally. People bring their stuff into session. And they need to process their stuff. So I don't hold that against them, but I in a sense, I feel like I have a right to have rules in my office. Now, what we do outside of the office is whatever, but you know, in my office, I try to keep some modicum of professionalism and boundaries.
I agree. I was just going to jump in. It's kind of like two or three things. One, you know, you may say something about it. You don't let it just pass, but you don't make it a corrective action because that's not your role. But you say something about it, you address it, you don't try to correct it and get into an argument about it or whatever else. And then you set very strict guidelines and boundaries, and then you go from there. Because sometimes it's just not the best fit. And then at least you know it's not the best fit. This is not a place where you can do those kind of things. It's no different than like, you know, I've had kids where it's like, you know, maybe ADHDers, they want to come in and walk across my desk. We're not doing that. And it's just setting a limit and a boundary and just, you know, go from there.
So Jen, I know you work with lots of different healthcare professionals, counselors, therapists, etc. Your thoughts on this?
I agree. I think that that was great advice. I didn't have anything to add. I think that like it's going to vary from person to person. You have to keep your comfort level in mind, especially I think the question said regardless of the race of the provider, but we know that weathering contributes to the early like decay of like Black women's body, the degradation of Black women's bodies, right? So saying regardless of race is actually really harmful because it is affecting people's actual lives, right? And our therapists that are Black are also people. And so we want to make sure that we have like avenues and the ability to set boundaries to protect their physical lives. Because that's really what it comes down to. Your physical body is in danger when you're like not able to protect yourself from race-based trauma. So I think that like having the ability to hold those boundaries is absolutely crucial, and also like allowing the space for you know, for like people to process, like Dixon was saying.
Go Dixon.
Let's do something real quick. It'll take less than 30 seconds. So what Jen is talking about when she mentions weathering is so key. And if there's one big takeaway that number one, you need to go Google it and learn about it. I'm going to give you the 15-second version, which is everybody on this call has a sympathetic nervous system. It's your fight or flight nervous system. It's the thing that protects you, keeps you from getting hurt. anytime that gets activated, you run the risk of what we call idling really, really high, which means you start either burning calories too much or you don't burn enough. You affect your metabolism, you wear your body out, you get high blood pressure, you don't use your insulin as well, so you get diabetes. All of that weathering means that we then suffer disproportionately health-wise, which means that it puts us at risk for stroke and to have maternal pregnancy concerns. So y'all, this is super important. And there's even research, and it makes me mad, but I compartmentalize. It makes, there's research that shows that the end of your chromosomes, which are called telomeres, they are what's related to aging, and that these constant stressors for Black people are shortening our telomeres, which can then get passed down to our kids. So in a sense, we're passing down our trauma because it's being done to us, and we need to be better. So do not leave this session and go, well, that was interesting. No, you need to go Google weathering. You need to go Google what you need to Google so that we can stop this, because it's literally killing us. So sorry, soapbox, done.
So one of the last questions, and then I want to do a wrap up, but one of the questions is, what trends are you seeing with our younger Zoomer generation as it relates to racism? Should we be hopeful or scared? And let me also add that, because I don't know the exact ages for the Zoomer demographics, also what should be aware of for our kids or anyone younger than us.
I'm going to jump in there just because I have teenagers. And I have one that, is 19 and has a very diverse, group of friends and things like that. I think that we should be hopeful. I think that these kids, the youth that are coming up, they're very knowledgeable. They're inclusive. They embrace others. I think that they are behind a lot of the fervor behind the protests and things like that, getting out there, walking in the streets with us and saying, this is not okay. So I think we should be hopeful. I don't think that we need to be fearful and kind of hold back. I think we just need to keep pushing forward, keep having open dialogues, protest safely, things like that. And I think that we will ultimately see a change.
I think that the kids are all right, as they say, as Dixon said at the beginning of this call, kids, they see everything and they internalize it, and they're so brilliant and they pick it up. And you said it also at the beginning of this call, Stas. Lily is so smart and picked it up just like this, right? We don't give them enough credit, and we don't talk to them frankly enough. And I think giving ourselves the space to do that, and the space to make mistakes, and the space to say it raw with our kids can be so freeing, and can really free them to ask the questions that they need to ask.
Yeah, no, that's great. So as we come to a close here, because I promise we'll wrap it up in the next 5 minutes, but I want each of you to think about, each of you as our speakers, to think about what's one takeaway that you hope participants, attendees, those that are watching later, that they'll learn from this conversation and take either into their own practices, with their own families, or maybe just with their own friends or society. Because again, it's an open town hall. So whether you are a client of ACFS, a friend of ACFS, a general community member, a parent, you saw it in a group or saw it was live, what's the takeaway for us? So Dixon, I'm going to start with you.
Awesome. So again, thanks for joining us this afternoon. So the takeaway for me is, you are a terrible therapist for yourself, because it's really hard to step outside yourself and look back and go, oh, that doesn't make any sense. So in other words, it's really hard to see your blind spots. Work on your blind spots. You have them, I have them, we all have them. And so sometimes that blind spot is in relationships and just your life. Sometimes it pertains to culture and ethnicity and race, right? So learn your blind spots, get a therapist.
I like that. So Jen, I'm going to tag it over to you.
I also have had a great time on this panel. It's been really dope. I was the oddball here, and I'm into that. I dig it. I want to say mess some stuff up. Divest from whiteness next week. Reject some whiteness. Figure it out. I got you.
Got it. And so Camille, for you.
This has been great. I really have enjoyed having this conversation. I know Sassi and I, we've had many of these little conversations inside, and I think that this has been really great to be able to reach other people. My takeaway is that this is a trauma, and this trauma is real. And as providers, that is our foremost responsibility, is to be able to recognize that, so that once, you know, Dixon sends them to therapy, we can appropriately address that trauma and truly be helpful, because this is a trauma. It's real. It's true.
Yeah. So just a couple remarks in closing, because I think all of those are great takeaways. For those that are like me, that may have, you know, been a little bit confused of, okay, what does it mean to move away from whiteness? What does this mean to have these conversations? Sometimes I think about the old adage of, you know, whatever you're talking about most is where your priority is. And if you think about, so often we talk about our favorite shows, we talk about religion, politics, the things we're passionate about. We talk about Facebook all the time. You can almost hear it in a conversation every day. If we're talking about it with that frequency, why can't we have these same hard conversations about talking of how do we have different friends? How do we make those connections that so that we can learn without expecting others to be the token speaker for an entire group of people? And I think challenging ourselves to look at, you know, where can I grow in these things? Or Google, why are people mad? What does it mean to get rid of whiteness? How do I support others in this journey? What are good movies? I think all of those things, it's easy to Google. So we can start there, and we can start with what's one new thing I'm going to do each day. Because for me, I'm very task oriented. So I hear these things and I get overwhelmed, and I'm like, okay, so now where do I go? So I would just say, just to summarize, start with Google, because Google can be good, but look at multiple sources. Challenge yourself to do one different thing each day. And if you're talking to your kids about it, ask the questions with them of, where should we find the answers? Or even for me, one of the things I learned very early on with having a biracial child was I went to go find a doll that looked like her. And it's things we take for granted. And there were not a lot of selections. Or what about different hair types or things like that? Looking into the ways that, are we surrounding ourselves with a diversity of speakers, authors, dolls for our kids, background stories? Are we educating ourselves on different things in history that are hard to swallow? So those would be my takeaways. Now, for those that have hung on to the end, I promised I would let you out very close to being on time. So I appreciate you guys for sticking with us the last hour. Those that did register online through the Facebook link or through our newsletter, you'll get a post, I guess, webinar survey just asking, what are your thoughts? What questions do you have? What would you like to see future town halls on? Do you feel like it would be helpful to have one specifically talking to kids, or would that be something you're nervous about? As well as, I think we have one coming up in a couple weeks, and we'll post it soon, for our Spanish speaking clients. So we're looking to try and get that set up so that everyone can have access and awareness to discussing these hard topics and how we move forward. So be inspired, be hopeful for the next generation. Thank you to all of our speakers. They were fabulous. And again, everyone have a great evening.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.